Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 8 of Crusade, Appearances and Other Deceits. And I rather enjoyed this one. It's got a sort of weird old school Space 1999 vibe to it. And if you remember what Space 99 was, then you are indeed old school, just like me. This one makes me chuckle actually because it's kind of wacky in some respects. It's got this sort of fairly serious main storyline going through it, but also this sort of bizarre stuff about changing the uniforms and the colours of the ship and stuff. But the thing that immediately drew my eye when I started rolling it was that I thought, I know that guy who's on the bridge. Who's that guy? Who's that guy? And I went, Night Watch. It's the Night Watch guy from Babylon 5. It's Mr. Wells. It's Mr. Wells from Babylon 5. And he was one of the people who initiated the Ministry of Peace. And in one of the early conversations with Matthew Gideon, he says, trust me on this one, Captain. If anyone knows how to survive political changes, it's me. Because, of course, the Ministry of Peace was part of the Clark regime, big style. And so the fact that he's still around is genuinely quite impressive. It really, really is. Actually, he was played by John Vickery. And I'm wondering who else... Did John Vickery play somebody else as well? Yes, he was Naroon, that's right. He was Naroon in Babylon 5 as well. But it was in The Fall of Night that we first met Mr. Wells, which was the last episode of Season 2 of Babylon 5. And it was all kicking off in that episode as well. But we got a very, very clear indication that, you know, Night Watch was not to be trifled with in this episode, and that he was really sort of pushing that kind of agenda with them. So, we find that the ship, that the Excalibur, has pulled up alongside another derelict ship, and this happened shortly after we've had this rather surreal conversation between a chap called Kevin, who's clearly Camp Az, in a very sort of 90s camp fashion. And basically, he and Mr. Wells have been on the ship for 3 days, and Gideon is already considering killing them because their role, their mission, appears to be to make the Crusade and make the Excalibur and its crew more palatable to the people back on Earth, because they're basically saying that one of the major issues that they have back on Earth at the moment is panic. And one of the few things that's calming that panic down is the fact that Excalibur and her crew are out trying to find a cure for the Drac Plague. So the way in which the mission is being presented, Earth Gov has decided is therefore very important. So although they've got 4 years to find a cure, they've got to deal with a panic issue now. So this is what they're going to do. And they seem to be not liking the colours. They say it's too dark. They say it's not dark enough. It's too light. So they want to actually tone everything down, even though they've got really dark uniforms on already, which is odd. But anyway, so basically they want to revamp the entire ship, it seems, to present it in quite literally a different light. So they're having this initial discussion when they come across what is effectively a ghost ship. But we see that it's detected the approach of the Excalibur, and it's actually sent out a signal to pull the Excalibur in towards it. And this is basically the goal. It's obviously it's a trap, because it's going to be a trap, isn't it? So called Matheson, the telepath, gets sent out in his spacesuit, and initially I was thinking that's quite a clever idea because he'll be able to use his telepathy to sort of get a scan of the ship, but there's no mention of him trying it. And then it occurred to me that they're in normal space, so he'd still need line of sight. It's not like hyperspace where his powers get amped up. So a whole squad of them go over in EVA flight suits, and they discover that there's no outward sign of a firefight, so combat with another ship, but there is an explosion from inside the ship outwards. So it looks like someone from inside the ship is actually trying to depressurize the ship, which is odd, clearly. I should mention as well, the credits came up at this point, and the episode was written by Jay Mercer, but it's directed by Via Koto. It's directed by Stephen First, which was terrific, because it hadn't occurred to me that he started doing some directing in Crusade. I'm not even sure if this is his first episode, but his name just really hit me for this one. So I thought, yeah, that's nice. So what then happens is that there are various dead aliens floating around. We never actually learn the name of the alien race, I don't think, in the whole episode. But it's clear there's been a struggle on board, and it's, vacuum has happened maybe about a week ago, they think. But the only life sign that's left on board is one of these aliens in a pod, in a sort of sort of life capsule type thing, and everyone else is dead. And we see that there's a sort of a chain of aliens going up towards this pod, which seems very strange. And we learn why later. So basically, this pod with the only survivor is of course brought on board the Excalibur, because you would, wouldn't you? So they start to sort of analyse the languages that they found, various things written on walls rather oddly. But a medtech called Jane takes it upon herself to go into the med chamber when the alien starts to crash, despite the fact that it had been stable up until this point. And so she goes in without a protection suit on. She puts a breathing mask on, but that's all the protection she's got. And she's going to hit it with a defibrillator, which I thought was a bit odd, because, presumably they've done enough of a scan of it, they know the defibrillator isn't going to fry it, so that's okay. But I just thought it was a rather curious thing to be doing to an alien creature that you've only just met as a first contact, and you're going to start zapping them with electricity. But anyway, so when she approaches it, it reaches out for her, and we see a sort of shimmering effect. So I immediately think, yep, that's a sort of transference thing, and then the alien dies, notwithstanding the fact that it's getting thumped by the defibrillator on a fairly regular basis for a little while. So Jane then starts to infect others with whatever it is that she was infected with. But it's immediately apparent that what she's doing isn't normal infection, because she's then able to command the people who she's infected. So it seems as if there's some sort of personality takeover happening whenever she does this. And Dr. Chambers notes to Gideon that when they scanned the mind of the alien, it was as if there were sort of echoes of other personalities in there, like sort of cascade of different mental images in his head. So we as the viewer can immediately surmise that basically there are lots and lots of individuals in this alien, and they are being released by Jane's touch as she goes about. And she starts quite quietly, because she starts sort of infecting quite low-level members of the crew initially, and of course they then geometrically go on to start infecting others. So Alison is on translation duty in the sort of the ship mess hall, and he's muttering about it being sort of non-numerical, so it's harder to sort of break it down. And whilst he's trying to sort of figure it out and muttering away to himself and eating salty food that he asks for more of, Jane is busy infecting and controlling more and more personnel. So when Gideon comes in for breakfast, Alison is still there, having pulled an all-nighter, and he thinks that the speech that he's recorded and has listened to from logs is actually different to the writing that Matheson saw on the walls. So he's not really sure what's going on, whether or not they speak in one language but write another, which seems odd. And so quite literally the writing is on the wall in the travel tube that when the Matheson gets on it. So he thinks that's not good, because obviously the last time he saw that was on an alien spaceship where all the aliens were dead. So we then have this rather curious little episode where Kevin and Mr. Wells are discussing that the uniform that's being worn on the Excalibur currently is standard for Explorer class vessels. But Kevin feels that it just won't do, and it needs to be something different. At this point in time, Wells gets infected, but unfortunately Kevin doesn't. But Wells immediately takes off, and Kevin's just sort of left in his wake, basically. But interestingly, Wells then becomes the spokesperson for the alien presences that are taking over various members of the crew. And as the infection continues, we see people starting to notice that something's not quite right, because as soon as people are infected, they just kind of break off their conversations and go off and do something completely different. And fortunately for Eilison, he cracks the code by analysing the captain's log, theorising that it mentions ship a lot. And once he's figured out what ship is, he can then start deciphering everything else. But as soon as he gets the translation, he realises what's going on, just as Jane is about to reach him to capture him as well. So he absolutely legs it for a travel tube. And she does a sort of body snatchers style scream to sort of summon all the infected around her to try and stop him getting away. And interestingly, Eilison dashes down a corridor taking fire, and he shouts for a security guard to hold the door for him, basically. And the security guard does, but he gets shot in the back of the neck, and he sort of falls into the travel tube with Eilison. And he's later declared brain dead, because he's taken a shot to his brainstem, effectively. So, although Eilison now knows what's going on, and he immediately sort of calls for Gideon to shut down all travel between decks, they've already lost a couple of decks, basically, to this infection. And it transpires, as he explains to Dr. Chambers and Gideon, that the alien ship took a probe on board that had a sort of an organic energy source, and the infection proceeded to spread on that ship, and its captain did manage to control it for a while, but he wasn't able to successfully keep control of his ship. So in the end, he basically decided to scuttle his ship in order to stop the infection spreading to other worlds. So it's apparent that basically the Excalibur is going to go the same way, despite the fact that they have, for the time being at least, successfully contained the threat. And this is about the time when Wells makes his appearance as the spokesperson of the group, and basically he says that they need to talk. And Gideon notes that Eilison was right, and therefore he'll be insufferable for days. And Eilison is quite interesting in this episode, because for once, as Dr. Chambers notes, he's a bit different to normal in the sense that he's actually quite disturbed, in a sense that the security officer put himself in harm's way to protect him. And he wonders what went through his mind, and Dr. Chambers says it's just what they're trained to do, but he actually asks what his name is. So for once we actually get a name put to the poor red shirt who's been clobbered, and his name is Stuart Greenberg. And Eilison just sort of, is sort of very taken by the fact that this guy has sacrificed himself when he didn't really know him from Adam. But Dr. Chambers is she's more sort of resigned to the fact that that was his mission, in the sense that he was there to look after the crew, and he's performed his mission in looking after Eilison. So Gideon goes to meet, albeit not directly, Wells, and they speak through a sort of sealed airlock hatch. And it's apparent that this race, whatever they are, they don't terraform places, they terraform people. And by doing this, they are sort of unfurling themselves onto worlds without firing a shot, although shots might well be fired once they realise what's happening. Their aim is basically to keep on multiplying, but doing so not through force of arms, but just through their sort of contact and their ability to transfer this sort of race memory, these race personalities that they carry with them, into other living organisms as they go. And it seems like a bit of a Mexican standoff, because the aliens want to go to an inhabited world so that they can take it over, in return for which they'll give Excalibur back to Gideon. But Gideon says it's too high a price to pay, because obviously he doesn't want another world getting taken over for the sake of preserving his ship. And he says to Matheson, ultimately, they will scuttle the ship if they need to. And as much as dear old Kevin is annoying Matheson, they do figure out that the Russian dolls can be stacked back together, because Kevin sees that the alien creatures that Matheson saw had formed this chain pointing towards the pod, and he's basically sort of saying, that's not just form, it's also function. And Matheson thinks he's right, because he understands that they could perhaps, given that there was only one of them could survive in the pod, they wanted to get all of the personalities that had sort of unfolded from the core personality back into one body that could then be preserved, along with all the personalities, which would then mirror what Dr. Chambers found when she analysed the brainwave patterns and discovered that there were lots and lots of sort of different overlapping patterns in there. So they figured that out, but Wells has realised that they're trying to lower the temperature in order to sort of freeze them out and put them into one area. And he's not particularly keen on this, because he did say to Gideon that he would start taking action if he didn't get what he wanted. So he actually proves the Russian doll theory almost immediately, because he takes one personality back into him, and then they smoke the body that the personality was in, because it's now of... Well, the body is still of use to them, but the personality has already been saved. So they basically say that he's now got 10 minutes to reach them and talk to them, otherwise they're going to kill somebody every 5 minutes. Which will deprive themselves of hosts, but obviously it's a way to put pressure on Gideon to do what they want. But one plus side of the cold is that they have successfully put them all into one place. So Gideon goes to see them in an EVA suit, and that leads to another Mexican standoff, because he's realised that the reason that the alien actually sort of willed itself to death, despite the fact that it was ostensibly stable, was to get someone in with it who wasn't in a protective suit. So he's reasoned quite reasonably that if he's wearing a protective suit, they can't transfer one of their personalities into him, and he's right. And he also points out that he doesn't have to kill anyone to stop them from trying to take him by force. He can just kneecap them, and the body can then be fixed later, but it won't be of any use in a fight to them. So again, we're in a sort of a bit of a sort of standoff situation, but they then point out to him that he's basically got an hour's worth of oxygen in his suit, so they'll just wait, which is not unreasonable. And he then does this really, really sort of corny gag, which is kind of it says the air is human. He says the air is human because he knows he's being monitored. And Ileson then gets very, very pleased with himself, because he says, yep, I've got it, I know what it means. So the plan will be to do exactly what the other alien ship did, so why it's taken them so long to figure it out, I don't know. But basically, they will evacuate the air in the affected sections, which will force the aliens into putting the Russian doll back into one doll, with a view to that one then trying to get to an EVA suit, like Gideon, in order to preserve all the personalities. And this plan does go swimmingly, and they manage to get it all arranged. They evacuate the necessary areas and so on. Weirdly, it's actually Ileson on the ship intercom ordering people around to do this. As far as I'm aware, he's not actually in the chain of command for the starship. But anyway, so that was a thing that I just noticed in passing. So everyone runs around appropriately, and an airlock is opened very unceremoniously, and the people in the affected area begin to choke to death as Gideon watches on. So they all transfer the personalities along the chain, because they're all in the same place, of course, back into Wells. And Wells then sort of staggers past Gideon and starts staggering towards the nearest airlock. And he finds a monkey wrench on the floor, knocks out someone in a spacesuit, takes off their glove gauntlets and transfers all the personalities into them, assuming that that spacesuit is going to provide him with an atmosphere and therefore allow him to move around. Unfortunately, Allison's cunning plan involved Stuart Greenberg, whose body has been kept alive on life support despite the fact that he is basically brainstem dead. Now, the thing that I'm not sure about at this point is, if he's brainstem dead, if his brain is actually dead, well, I assume his brain isn't dead. I assume his brain is still operational, but it can't talk to his body. And therein lies the rub here, because the aliens have gone into a body that they can't move. So they're in its brain, but the brain can't make the limbs move. So technically, yes, they're alive, congratulations, but you can't actually do anything. So they're trapped. And Wells is freed from their influence off the back of that, of course, and they repressurize. But then, to my mild surprise, because I didn't remember this bit of the episode, they then jettison poor old Greenberg out of the airlock, and they blow him up, just for good measure. And as he's blown up outside the ship, we actually see a sort of a brief glimpse of an energy form dissipating after the shots of obviously totally destroyed his spacesuit. So it's kind of slightly sort of Vorlon-esque almost. The nature, and that would kind of fix. We know that they could inhabit people. So in fact we've seen that with more than one alien race over the course of Babylon 5. That this sort of idea of habitation. So that is the end of the sort of immediate threat. But the one very interesting aspect of this is that there's a sort of last minute attempt by the aliens who are effectively locked into Greenberg's body, and then they say, or they try and say, because of course they can't move his mouth, that they know what the crew's looking for and they know where it is. So there is this implication that actually they might have had a cure for the Drac plague, but because of the way in which they were dealt with, that knowledge is now going to be lost with them, unless for some bizarre reason they actually wrote it down, because they seem to be very, very keen on writing stuff down for no apparent reason. But anyway, so we then get the rather curious sight of about 3 Omega destroyers lined up to tow the derelict alien ship back to somewhere, presumably where it can be analysed and the database analysed to see if it's got anything of value in it and to it. And of course Gideon encourages them to decontaminate it extremely thoroughly before they start doing anything clever with it, which makes perfect sense, of course. And to Kevin's delight, the Omegas have brought the new uniforms, which apparently are supposed to convey power, dignity and presence. But Gideon just thinks that he looks like a bellhop. He's not wrong. But the irony is that this was part of the sort of the shenanigans that were going on behind the scenes with Crusade, that they decided that they were supposed to get these different styles of uniforms. Now, I spotted a few different lighter coloured uniforms during the course of the episode, and you'll probably have seen them in some of the screen captures. So I don't know if that was supposed to be a sort of gradual thing, but this was the in-universe explanation for why they were having to do this uniform change. But I think this was all part of the way in which they were trying to sort of bully different aspects of the show into going different ways that JMS didn't want to go, which is why it got shut down. But the other thing about this episode I noticed as well, whilst we're on the topic of uniforms, is that Dr. Chambers seems to be incredibly casually dressed all the time. Normally, MedLab personnel have very obvious MedLab style uniforms on. She doesn't really seem to go for that terribly much, and I don't know why. I don't know why she doesn't have to wear it when she's the head of the MedLab on the ship. I mean, it just seemed very, very odd. But yeah, it's sort of an odd choice in that sense, and it's odd that they should have to deal with it in this way in the episode. And I didn't particularly dislike the episode. As I say, it did remind me of an old school science fiction show, and this sort of thing has probably been done before to a degree, and you could kind of see how it was going to work out as well. But it was well executed, I thought, of its sort. It was purely a sort of very very loose links to the Drac Plague, with Gideon sort of justifying investigating the ship because he said penicillin was found by accident, so we can't afford to pass up any sort of significant opportunity. That's what he says to Wells. So we can kind of see why you would investigate it, although again any ship probably could have done that. It didn't have to be the Excalibur. But anyway, so yeah, it was an interesting idea that you would sort of spread your influence not by taking over worlds by force, but just by sort of moving your minds, the minds of your people into other people's minds. Effectively, it's quite an interesting, quiet way to take stuff over. But presumably they've tried this a few times, and they said that they sent out more than one probe, I believe, at one point as well. So clearly the crew, although it became the crew of the Excalibur's problem, the other aliens did at least try and compartmentalize it, and keep it aboard their ship, because if anyone did let them loose on a colony world, then they just presumably they just go absolutely bananas, and you'd have sort of a mass spread. So presumably this is the least successful takeover plan ever, because they're not sort of running rampant through the entire universe. But that remains to be seen, I guess. It's not really clear how long they've been floating in space for before somebody found them or anything like that. It doesn't go into that much depth in those terms. But there is this sort of interesting hint that they might have had a cure for the Drac Plague, or have known of one, but you don't really know how much that was a sort of desperation measure to try and preserve themselves, because obviously being a reasonably intelligent species, they could have just fabricated that as a concept just to try and buy themselves more time. I certainly wouldn't have put it past them to do that. But overall, again, another quite sort of solid episode, some good sort of interactions, some slightly sort of random characters and so on in it as well, but not the worst episode of science fiction I've ever watched, by any stretch of the imagination, So and I quite like the derelict alien ship as well, because it was quite unusual. It didn't look like anything we'd ever seen before, which Babylon 5 has always been very, very good at. I remember when we first saw the Stribe ship, for example. That was just interesting because it looked quite asymmetric. Didn't look like an Earth ship, didn't look like any of the other ships. It was just its own kind of unique type of ship. But Matheson does mention that it's kind of it's got a jump engine, so it was obviously capable of making its own solo jumps, which means it was quite a hefty ship. And Gideon notes that despite the fact there was only one life form detected, it needed hundreds, and we do see a lot of bodies on the ship. So it was a big ship. And not a race that anyone recognised clearly either, because no one sort of called it out, and they didn't know the language, which implies it was a genuine first contact situation. So again, interesting little bits. No universal translator in sight. It was down to Ireson to try and figure out the language, using his brain basically, which is again nice to see, and exactly what he was there for as well. Because at the end of the day, this is what IPX does for a living. So his ability to sort of figure that out was, does make him a very valuable member of the crew. So yeah, so that was that really, and I guess that all of the crew members, barring two, actually survive, and that is the last point to make on this actually. And this is not dissimilar to something that we saw Sinclair do in the first season of Babylon 5. Where we see Gideon in the final moments having to sort of write condolence letters to Greenberg's parents, because effectively he saved the ship. As Alison notes, had it not been for his initial sacrifice and then his subsequent sacrifice, which Dr. Chambers seems to have been all right with, because again, basically he's ended up very, very dead now, whereas he was alive, at least technically before. He's now been blown to pieces. But she feels that that's what he would have wanted in doing his duty. We never even got a word out of him, I don't think. So it was very sort of passing. And we also get another letter for the the guy who Mr. Wells did kill as a sort of demonstration of his ill will and his taking the measure to force Gideon's hand. And Alison says at one point, you know, who speaks for these people who are just sort of sacrificing themselves, and Dr. Chambers says Gideon does, and you know, she wouldn't wish that on anyone, but that is his job. That's what he's there to do. He's there to speak for the people who can no longer speak for themselves. So I like that as an ending, because it's a very JMS sort of ending to say, don't forget the fact that, you know, the heroes are only surviving because others are laying down their lives and their futures in order to allow them to survive, and that's the path that they've chosen to be their sort of fulfillment in life. So it's a nice sort of nod of the head to the red shirts, and it's a theme we've seen before, but it helped to add a little bit of depth to what otherwise might have been a sort of slightly throwaway episode. But I think it's a good one, and I like the callback to, you know, using Mr. Wells and sort of calling it back again to Babylon 5 again. For people like me, that's a very nice callback, and it's cleverly done. And he's still kind of doing what he was doing before, but in a slightly softer way, perhaps. And it is deeply ironic that he is still active, given what he was involved in during the course of the Babylon 5 series. But again, it's a nice little sort of tip of the cap to an established character. So that's nice to see. So I'll leave it there for now, and I've only got a few more to go. And in fact, the next one's got a commentary on it, I noticed. So I can't quite remember what the details of it are, but I'll look forward to listening to the commentary, as well as perhaps just watching it straight through, and I can let you know a little bit more about that one off the back of the commentary. So that's it. Do like and subscribe as ever, and cheers for now.